Hello and welcome to a Bermuda Triangle Highlander deck profile. We've shown this deck off on the channel now. It's time to show what cards we changed in it. And if you're a beginner to the premium format, this is a very important deck to learn about because it's always been a meta contender and probably will be for the foreseeable future. So hopefully you can use this video to get a feel for how the deck works and what cards you would need if you want to play it yourself. And I do recommend trying it out sometime if you can borrow it or if you can pick up the cards. Because it's a very fun deck, and it's a deck that has a lot of room for innovation and for tinkering if you like to customize your list and make it your own. But without any further ado, let's get started. This is our starter, Bermuda Triangle Cadet Shizuku. It is a very important card to play because it gives you access to, not that card, this card, Shirtsuyu, which is an easy countercharger. I'm not currently playing it in the list, but because this is a deck that changes a lot, it's important to have options. And so at some point in the future, you might end up playing this card, or you might end up playing it right now. And having access to the starter will just save you trouble in the long run. Next is our main ride target. This is Velvet Voice Reindeer. This is the card that makes the deck function, single-handedly keeps it in the meta. What Reindeer does is when it attacks, you discard 2 cards and you reveal the top 10. And then if all the cards have different names, if all the normal units have different names, you get to ride a card from the pile. And then at the end of the turn, you put the card on the bottom of the deck and you ride Reindeer from Soul. Now that means you're generating extra force markers because you're riding the card from the pile and then Reindeer again. You're generating at least 1 more Vanguard swing. You're generating potentially additional rearguard swings if the Vanguard you ride into gives you access to multi-attack. And you're also forced to play all one-ofs, which isn't as big a drawback as it sounds. Reindeer herself counts as a trigger unit when revealed from the deck, which means we can play 4 copies without causing any of our Highlander effects to brick, which is very good in helping this deck's consistency. And the power of getting a rewrite in the middle of the battle phase is well worth the drawback. Automatic 4 of, single-handedly the reason to play this deck, and a very fun card to play as well. Next up is our grade 4 ride targets. These are the things you generally want to be hitting when you reveal cards for Reindeer's effect. They're all pretty good in their own way, and let's get started with what I think is the strongest one. This is Laura. This card, when it's placed, reveals the top 10, and if all the normal units have different names, you can call any number of the revealed cards, and they each get 10,000. In general, we cannot brick on any of these reveal 10 card effects because we're playing one of all of our normal units, with the exception of Reindeer, which counts as a trigger. And all these effects, with one exception that I can get into later, only care about normal units having different names. So these will always work. They're not as random as they sound. And this one in particular will give us a full board call. And if we have an Excel marker from an Ezka, potentially 3 rearguard attacks, and all the numbers will be pretty good. It also provides a tremendous amount of deck thinning if we can call all normal units. And will usually be a solid finisher, though this card drops off in power if we get too long into the game, because we'll run out of good cards to call. The other drawback of this is that it encourages you to play suboptimally. When you have a full board recall, you're encouraged to swing with your rear guards before your Vanguard, because you might have to call over those rear guards. And that means that when you swing with Reindeer, you won't have anywhere to put triggers, which can be a problem. So it's important to keep in mind what ride targets are left in the deck. If you've already seen Laura and you've already seen Tiroa, which we'll get into later, you know that you don't have anything that'll punish you for swinging Vanguard first. And so you'll be able to adjust your attack pattern to play more optimally. And that's going to be a skill that you'll need to acquire if you want to play this deck. You'll need to be good at remembering what options are left in the deck and which ones are gone. And since everything's a one-of, that does require a lot of memorization. But the good news is that it's not as hard as it sounds. If you just keep playing the deck, you'll eventually pick it up by feel. Next is an Ezka. This card is the best setup card to get us into the late game. What it does is when it's placed, you reveal 10 cards from the deck. If all the normal units have different names, then you get 1 of every imaginary gift, which means we're getting 2 force markers, 1 from riding her, and then 1 from this effect, 1 protect marker, and 1 excel marker. The excel marker will usually be excel 2 so that we can draw a card, and the protect marker will usually be protect 1 so that we get a perfect card. This means we're getting 2 cards to hand and building a potent board for the future. In general, you want to ride this on your first grade 3 turn, and you want to consider riding one of the other targets when you're ready to kill the opponent, because this one doesn't really offer any more attacks. But still, this being the best thing to ride into early means we're very happy to play it, and it's a very strong card. Next up is Olivia. This one is the restand grade 4. When it attacks, you choose up to 5 rear guards with different names, you stand them, and if you stood 3 or more, you get a crit on the Vanguard. This is a resourceless multi-attack. It doesn't cost any counterblast or soul blast, and that makes it very good in the late game when we're out of resources. It makes it good when our opponent's damage denying us, and it's very strong when we have powerful rear guards like the Pearl Sisters, which I'll get into later, or if we've put triggers onto our rear guards and we want to reuse the crit. Really strong card, and we're very happy to play it. Next up is Tirua. This is the other card that encourages us to play suboptimally. When it's placed, you bounce any number of normal units on either player's circles back to their hand. And if you bounce 3 or more cards this turn, it gets plus 15k. And then when it attacks, if you've bounced 3 or more, you can counterblast 1 and discard and restand it, and it gets drive -1. Now, the restand also works on rearguard, which makes us a good rearguard attacker. And if we put force markers on the Vanguard, the restanding Vanguard swing is also very good. But again, because this bounces our board, we're encouraged to attack with the rear guards before the Vanguard, meaning we have nowhere to put the triggers. And if we put the triggers on our Vanguard, we're just going to ride a new Vanguard from Ranger's effect, and we're going to lose the bonus. So you'll have to keep in mind if this card is still in your deck when you're attacking in the mid-game. Next up is Anj. This is one of the better ride targets for Ranger's effect. Not as good as the grade 4s in my opinion, but still very solid. When it attacks, you counterblast 1, you choose any number of normal units on any player's R, and you return them to hand. And you activate effects based on the number of cards you returned. So for 2, you get 10,000 till end of turn, and for 3 or more, you get a force marker, and for 4 or more, you search your deck for a unit and call it to R. This means you get easy access to multi-attack, because you can call a card with a superior call effect and call another card off of that effect, so you can get 2 more attacks. You can call the best card from your deck, whatever's good in the situation. You can bounce defensive cards to reuse them, which I'll get into later. And in general, it hits good numbers and builds additional force markers, setting us up for the late game. Next up is Lupina. This is a restand grade 3. When it attacks, you counterblast 1, and you stand all your rear guards on force marker circles. That means that we can reuse things we've put triggers on, like with the other one, but it also means we have to split our force markers, which can be a downside. Sometimes you want to stack all the force markers on one circle, and sometimes you want to put them on the Vanguard, but this card will force us to put at least 1 on each rearguard column. And the fact that it costs counterblast means it's susceptible to us being damage denied or us running out of resources. Next up is the Spicy Tech. This is Krysrain. It's a card from Standard. We can't make too much use of the main act ability because we don't want to ride this. We want to ride Reindeer, and even if we do, we can't use energy because we do not have the energy generator crest. However, as a last-ditch ride target, it's not the worst thing in the world. We're mainly interested in the Divine skill, which just requires us to attack with this card into a grade 3 or greater unit, which is very easy to do because we're going to ride this in the late game in premium. We're going to choose to ride other things with Ranger's effect until our opponent's on grade 3, and then we're going to use this as a finisher. At the end of the battle, this unit attacked. For the Divine skill, we return all rear guards into our hand, and then we choose a card from our hand and call it to R, and then we make that card's power and crit match Krysrain. So you're going to put all the triggers on the Vanguard when you attack with this, and then you're going to call something to an empty circle, preferably the one that doesn't have the force markers, because this will overwrite the power from force markers. And then we will hopefully call something that has a superior call effect, call to the column with the force markers at that effect, and then the weak card will match the Vanguard, and then the card we called with the superior call will be on the force markers and be good. So we'll get 2 more good swings. If we have been putting force markers on the Vanguard, this will probably make this attack at least 33. And this card and Tirua both encourage you to put markers on the Vanguard. So now we should generally be shifting the pattern of play for this deck to favor putting markers on one rearguard circle and the Vanguard and ignoring one column. Next up is our grade 2s. This is Jewelry Like Lucina. When placed, counterblast 1, soul blast 1. You look at 3 cards, you call 1, put 1 to hand, and put 1 on the bottom. Best ride target as we're riding up from grade 0 to grade 3. Enables ride down if we ride into this off of Ranger's effect, which is not optimal, but sometimes it'll happen. And it also just pluses. And you can pitch this for discard costs later in the game when we no longer are interested in riding it. Next up is Melty. This is a card that rewards us for what we're already trying to do. We're trying to call a full board every turn, and this card just gives us counterblast 1 and draw a card when we call it and call another unit. So we're getting rewarded with a card for something we were going to do anyways. Decent card, and sometimes we have extra counterblast to pay that cost, so it's not a big deal. Aside from that, if we don't have the counterblast, it's just a vanilla 10k, so you can also feel free to discard this card for costs. And there's a lot of discard for costs. Reindeer discards, our main stride discards, some other cards of this card. So having these cards that are situationally useful, that we can't really use on certain turns, is fine, because we can just discard them to pay for stuff. Next up is Sistico. This is a very important synergy card for the deck. It also saw some play in the Bermuda Mill deck, if you remember that. What this card does is when it's placed, you put a normal unit from your drop on the bottom of the deck, and then if you put a grade 3 or greater unit, you can choose an opponent's rear guard, and that unit can't stand during the next turn. This is a very good effect because we have all of these ride targets that we want to keep in the deck, and sometimes we'll draw them, and we can't really use them as rear guards very well, and we don't want to ride them because we want to ride reindeer, so we'll be discarding them. And we'll want to put them back into the deck so that reindeer can always hit a good card. We can also use this multiple times a turn to get a lot of recycling. And also, if a rear guard is returned, it gets 10k, so it's a decently sized attacker. Basically solves all of our problems. Next up is Germain. This is the Ride Fixer promo from V. At the beginning of your ride phase, if your Vanguard is a grade 1 or less, you could discard it, and you look at the top 5 cards, and you can pick your grade 2 or less card and put it into your hand. We're using this to smooth out our draws and to find important pieces. And then it has a decent rearguard effect. When it attacks while boosted, you counterblast 1, you bounce a rearguard, and then you call a mermaid with a different name from this card, which is not a drawback because we're playing all one-ofs, and you call it to R. So this lets you reuse the card on the force marker circle. You put this on the column on the opposite side, you swing with the thing on the force markers, then you swing with this boosted, you bounce that card and call it again, and you get another big attack. Next is Top Idol Aqua, one of the most important cards in the deck. Used to be even more critical than it is now because we used to have Q-Tire, but we don't have that anymore. What this card does is when it's placed on V or R, you return a unit from R to your hand, and then you draw a card and discard a card. This lets you reuse all of the good on-place effects in this deck, which is a very powerful thing to do, as well as discarding cards that we don't care about. And it also gets 5k if it's in the same column as another unit. So with an 8k behind it, it'll be attacking for 23 base, which is a good number. Next up is Courteous Beauty Saria. When this card is placed on V or R, we discard a card, we look at 3, and we add one of those cards to hand and put the rest on the bottom. Simple deck filtering, find cards that are good, put cards that are bad on the bottom of the deck, and then it gets additional power, going up from 5k to 10k when our opponent's on grade 3. Solid card, a good card to reuse the effect of, and will help us find reindeer when we're breaking on grade 3. Next up is Lizelot, one of the best cards in the deck. When this card is placed, you look at the top card of your deck, and you can call it to R, put it into Soul. So this just builds a board out of nothing. It can only be used once per turn as a hard once per turn effect. If you bounce it and replay it, you won't get the effect again. And it can be called as a grade 1, which means we can use this to grade 1 rush our opponent in matchups where that matters. This card with Krysrain will allow us to get multiple attacks because we'll call this and then give this Krysrain's power, and then we'll call something else to the force markers. The next card will also enable that, and in general, this is a really good card to have. Keep it in your hand when you're mulliganing, and it sets up a lot of synergies with our bounce and recall effects, because if we bounce this and call it on the next turn, we can get the effect again. Next up is Munching Girl Sia. This is the other card that enables multi-attack with Krysrain. When it's placed, you Soul Blast 1, you look at the top card, and you can either call it to R, or you can put it into your hand. If you put it in your hand, you choose a card from your hand and discard it. Another simple superior call effect. We used to play Murtoa in this spot, but Murtoa got banned, so this is the next best thing. The fact that it's only 3k is fine because we're going to use this either as a booster, or we're going to call it to a circle with force markers, or we're going to give it Krysrain's power. So that power is not really a drawback. Simple card that pluses. Also synergizes with Anj. We can call a card from this effect in the same turn we call this with Anj from the deck and get 2 more attacks. Next up is Justine. When this card is discarded, you Soul Blast 1 and call it to R. This is important because we have a lot of discard costs, so this can help us mitigate some of the drawbacks from that. And it also enables Ride Down. If we discard this to Reindeer's effect, we can resolve Reindeer's effect first, ride into the new target, and then Soul Blast 1 and call this, and Soul Blast the Reindeer. So this is the easiest way to get the Ride Down synergy. So it's a mandatory one of, but as Ride Down gets less and less vital, we can consider cutting this card. But the fact that it still synergizes with one of our strides and with some of our discard costs means that it's probably still worth playing. Next is Ingenuous Myrno. When this is placed, you reveal a normal unit and put it on the bottom of your deck, and then you draw a card. Which is really good because, as I mentioned, we have all these ride targets that are grade 4 and grade 3 that we don't want in our hand, we want them in our deck, and this gets them back in the deck. It also synergizes with Reindeer because when our grade 3 or greater unit is placed during the battle phase, if this is in the back row, we can give our Vanguard 10k. So when Reindeer re-rides from the deck, we can give that new Vanguard 10k, which is good because it gets drive -1 from Reindeer, so it'll be a weak attacker, unless we've been putting force markers on it. Next up is Cuddle Connect Finessa. This is another recycling card. At the end of the battle, the attacks are boosted. We put a grade 3 or greater card from the drop on the bottom of the deck. And then we put this unit into Soul and we draw a card. So this builds resources, builds a Soul and draws, and it recycles ride targets for Reindeer. Importantly, it says grade 3 or greater card, not normal unit, so you can put the grade 3 heals back in the deck, which can improve our trigger density. Next is Mermaid Idol Sedna. This card checks the top 5 for a grade 3, and then we put it in our hand and then discard a card. It also becomes a 13k if it's in the same column as another unit, making it a solid attacker or booster. And it helps us find Reindeer, which is really all it's for. Next is Popple Empathy Betty. This is the best replacement we have for to replace the cards that were banned. When it's placed, we reveal 7 cards on the top of the deck, and if all the normal units have different names, we can put a card from our hand on the bottom, and we can pick one of the cards in the pile, and then we shuffle the deck. Helps us filter and find specific toolbox pieces. We can find defensive cards. We can put triggers back into the deck or ride targets back into the deck, and we can reuse this if we bounce it. Very strong card and gives us very powerful selection. Next up are the Pearl Sisters. We have Pearl Sister Perle and Pearl Sister Perla. They do nothing on their own, but when you have both of them in play, they become 28Ks with crit, which makes them the best attackers in the deck. The problem is that we don't have an easy way to search for either of them, so you kind of just have to hope you get lucky and draw them both. So that means you shouldn't really play too hard to try to get them. If you get one, keep it in your hand if you can, but don't feel bad if one gets damaged, or if you have to discard one, or if one gets retired. It's not the end of the world. It's just a nice thing to have. If you get both, you probably win the game on the spot. Especially if you get them early, because attacking with both of these on turn 2, 28 and crit, is very difficult for the opponent to guard. In addition, we have lots of ways to reuse these. We have Hell Shroud, which will bounce and call 2 units, so we can call these again after bouncing them, getting 2 more crit attacks. We can restand them with 2 of our ride targets for Reindeer, and we can attack with them and then bounce them to hand to protect them with some of our other options. Very powerful cards. Do try to keep in mind that you have to get both, so you might have to ride one if you're grade locked, and it's not the end of the world because the synergy is kind of hard to set up now. Next up is our defensive package. I'll lay them all out and then go over the cards. All right. First up is Elementaria. This is the best perfect guard in the game. It's a blitz order, so it gets around guard restrict effects. It is a perfect guard that costs nothing if our opponent is on a stride, which will be most of the time in premium. Just a solid card all around, and it's mandatory for not getting combo killed by decks like Oracle Tink Tank. Next up is our anti-multi-attack package. This is Honolly. It forces the opponent to play Counterblast for rearguard swings after the 5th battle, or in the 5th or more battle, which is an important distinction. Just taxes our opponent's resources, and will probably force them to play to set up for the next turn rather than try to kill us. And then this is Blue-Haired Prodigy Resius. When this is placed, we give our Vanguard 10k, which is important because we have ways to call units on our opponent's turn with our G-Guardians. So we can give our Vanguard power 10k and make it harder for them to hit. And if we've already hit a defensive trigger, we can make it so that none of their attacks hit, and we can end their turn, essentially. Next up is Attractive Glow Sandy. This card can be pitched to pay for G-Guardians. So we essentially have 5 heal triggers in the deck. Very strong card, and if we can somehow get it back in hand, we can use it again. And then next up are 2 new cards. These are from the Sienna deck in Standard. When they're placed, you bounce a rear guard in the front row back to hand from your opponent's side. So if we call these with our G-Guardians, we can guard and attack with the G-Guardian, and then this effect will bounce the other front row rear guard, and we can potentially shut down 2 attacks. Against decks that rely on restanding rear guards or making gigantic rear guards, this can essentially end the opponent's turn. And then lastly is Rolock. This is a card that stops us from getting early rushed, and it's also a card that rewards us for going into Ride Down. If we ride back down to grade 2, this is a perfect card. A solid role player. We could consider cutting this card if we decided to commit to never riding down, but that's not the world we live in yet. Next up is our triggers. First up is our heals. We play 4 the grade 3 heal. This is the best one. It prevents early rush from the opponent. It can pay for stride, and they can be recycled with Finessa. So we're going to play these. Really solid card all around. Next up is our crits. We are playing 4 the stride crits. We want to stride every turn that it's legal to do so. So these are very important. Next up is the History Collection Errata draw crits. These keep us from playing the crit sentinels, which is worth mentioning. But these are the best triggers to hit defensively that aren't heals or the over trigger. They draw you a card when they are hit as damage checks, and we can't actually use the effect that puts them into soul because we're not playing Loris. And then next up is the draw triggers. We're playing 3 draw perfect cards because we're playing 1 Elementariat in the main deck. And then we're playing the Lyrical over trigger. Because we get so many rearguard swings per turn, we're getting something like 9 attacks a turn on a stride turn, and 3 of those are vanguards and 6 of them are rearguards. We get the extra 10k a lot. Now, one last note before we move on to the G-Zone is that there is a card that encourages us to play a different trigger lineup, and also encourages us to play slightly differently in general, and that is this Stride, Federica. Federica is one of the only cards that actually cares about trigger units having different names, as well as normal units. If we reveal 10 cards and all the cards are different names, we get to call 5 mermaids from our G-Zone with different powers, and they get plus 15k and can attack from the back row. So we get an easy 6 attacks for the cost of no resources. This can be a decent option to play, especially if you find yourself frequently running out of cards or running out of resources. But it is very luck-based, because it's hard to play all singleton triggers, because some of the triggers are really good and some of the triggers are really bad, so you want to play more of the good ones. But if you do want to play Federica, some trigger options you can consider are the draw trigger effect from Standard, the crit effect trigger from Standard, this stand trigger, Crook, and you can also consider things like the crit sentinel. You can consider things like the heal trigger that soul charges or counter charges. You can consider the 20k shield heal trigger, and you can consider the crit that puts itself in a soul when your Vanguard swings, and things like that. These are all kind of weaker than the options we're already playing, so you are making a sacrifice to try to play Federica, and the G-Zone is also packed pretty tight, so it's hard to justify it. One last thing to mention before moving on to the G-Zone is the existence of Gerlinda. This is the card I would play if I wasn't playing Krysrain. When placed, you reveal 7 cards on top of your deck, and if all the normal units have different names, you call 2 of the revealed cards to R and then shuffle your deck. So this is an easy 2 more rearguard swings. It also doesn't cost any resources, so we can use it in the same circumstances we would use Krysrain, but the attacks will be of slightly lower quality and will be a bit more luck-based because we're calling from deck and not from hand. Overall, this card used to be a solid role player, but now has kind of fallen out of favor. But it's worth considering if you don't like one of my ride target options. Next is the G-Zone. And we'll start off my proxy Harmonics Messiah. Harmonics Messiah is a staple, just get one. And then we'll go into the main stride, Helltrauda. This is the best card in the G zone. What it does is when it attacks, you discard 3 cards. You return all the cards on your circles other than V to your hand. And then you choose 2 cards from your hand and call them to R. This gives us easy access to multi-attack. This gives us the ability to reuse on-place effects. It gives us the ability to re-attack with strong attackers like the Pearl Sisters. And then at the end of the battle, you counterblast Soul Blast 1 and put this unit into your G zone face up and stand your Vanguard, which means we can use Reindeer's effect in the same turn that we use this. This will give us a potential of 9 to 10 attacks roughly, and all the attacks will be good as we'll continue accumulating force markers and making them scale. Very strong stride, and doesn't require generation break for any of the effects, so you can go into this on your first grade 3 turn if you're going second with no downside. This card, along with Reindeer, are what are making this deck so powerful. Next up is Shandi. This is the Harmony Stride. We're not currently playing any Harmony Synergy, so we don't get the maximum power ceiling for this card, but it's an easy way to get 2 more attacks. You just call something behind the Vanguard to get Harmony, and then when it attacks, you counterblast and turn a card face up from the G zone, and you look at 10 cards, and you call the same up to the same number of cards as you have Harmony cards. So you just attack with the front row, then attack with this, call 2 more to the front row. Next up is Somni. This is the History Collection Stride for Bermuda. We are not currently playing Loris, so we only need 1 copy of this, and we're using this as a resourceless 4-attack enabler, as well as a way to like bounce important cards back to our hand. This is like what we do when we can't kill the opponent. We just want like to not spend any resources. You could play Loris in this deck if you really like this card. If you do, play Loris and the grade 1 that searches for Loris, and then play 2 copies of this in the G zone. But I personally think that Reindeer is better to ride into than Loris, even when you're going first. Next up is the Tirawa Stride. This is a restanding Vanguard Stride, and it also puts 3 cards on the bottom of the deck. So it lets us put triggers back into the deck, and it doesn't cost any resources. So we can go into this when we don't have any counterblast, but we do need to be at GB3. And then we have Perfect Performance Anj. This is a GB2 Stride, so we can only go into this in the late game. But for Counterblast 2, we choose a face-down card from our G zone, turn it face up, and then we bounce any number of any player's cards in any circle other than V. And then we get 5k if we bounced, or we get 5k for each card returned. And then if the number of cards returned is 5 or more, we draw a card. And if the number of cards returned is 7 or more, we get drive +1. So we get a big Vanguard. We get to reuse all of our effects. And we also get to protect cards we want back in our hand. Pretty decent stride, and it's worth going into when we don't have a lot of cards in hand and we can't use Helltrauda. And then next up is Megiddo, the 0 with Dragon for Bermuda Triangle. This card, when it's placed, you counterblast 2, and then you can call any number of cards from hand or drop, and they gain the ability that they can switch places with another unit when they attack. So the advantage of that is you put all your force markers on 1 circle, and then you get to reuse that circle for every single rearguard attack, giving you 5 rearguard swings with like upwards of +30 or +40 power. But we need to discard a card with the same name as our Vanguard to stride into this, and we need to have 3 face-up cards in our G zone. So, and we lose strides for the rest of the game if we use this, so this has to finish the opponent off. And then lastly is the G Guardians. First off is Citron. This is the one that enables all of our defensive plays. When you G Guardian with it, you can call a card from hand, and if you do, this gets 10k shield. So that brings it up to 25 shield, usually enough to guard an attack. And then the call effect will give us a powerful defensive effect from that package I showed earlier. Really solid. We have to play 3 because it's the one we want to use the most. And the next is our other main defensive G Guardian. This is Lucrece. Counterblast 1 and return a normal unit from R to your hand, and then you perform one of the effects depending on its grade. 2 or less, you get 15k shield, and 3 or more, your Vanguard gets 5k till end of turn. Going into this when you've hit a defensive can put your Vanguard into a power where your opponent's attacks can't hit anymore, which makes it a decent effect. We can also, if we have Citron and a good defensive card, we can call Citron, bounce it back to hand with this, and then if we have a 3rd G Guardian, we can go into Citron again. And then lastly is our are two like flex G Guardians. You don't really need to play either of these, but they're both nice to have. This one is Sandy. You choose a face down G Guardian and turn it face up, and then you get a shield for every 2 cards in your hand, and then you can counterblast 1 and get another 5 shield. Mostly used to build Generation Break quickly, or if we're on our 4th G Guardian, we can flip over 1 more G Guardian with this to get more cards that face up in the G zone, but we don't have access to scaling for that, so it's not that useful. Mostly we're going to use this to get a big shield when we have a giant hand. And then last is Leona. This one bounces a card and calls a card a Guardian, and if you call the same card that you bounce, you get extra shield. So simply, if we have something we want to put on a Guardian circle because it's got high shield, we can choose that as the target. Honorable mention goes to Dismel. This is a G Guardian that protects your rear guards. I used to play it. I'm currently not playing it. I wanted to play Anj again, so I cut it. And that summarizes the entire deck. I hope that you learned something. We're, of course, not sure how good Krysrain is at the current moment, because we haven't gotten a lot of opportunities to test with it, and it's a new card. But looking at its effect, it seems to be about on par with the other ride targets for Reindeer, with its main weakness being that it doesn't generate force markers, meaning that it doesn't help us scale into the late game, and we can only use the Divine Skill once, so if we hit the copy again later, it's useless. But in general, the odds of riding into the same card with Reindeer twice in the game are pretty low, and it's nice to have a good closer that doesn't cost any resources in the late game when our resources are the most taxed. So let me know what you think about the deck in the comments, and let me know if there's a deck you'd want to see next.